Thank you for joining today's webinar. Presenting is Josh Golden, Senior Vice President of Strategy at Capital RX. He will be presenting on Cracking the Code, Unraveling Specialty Drug Costs and PBM Profits. Over to you, Josh.
Thanks very much, Hannah. And thanks to all of you for joining today for what promises to be hopefully a really exciting webinar on unraveling specialty drug costs and PBM profits and how those are connected. It's going to be a pretty fast-paced webinar. We're going to cover a lot of ground, so I appreciate you joining me for the next hour. A couple of quick disclosures before we get started. Actually, two formal disclosures. Number one, I am not a clinical pharmacist. So we are, in fact, if a drug has more than like 3 syllables in the name, I don't think I'm even authorized to try and pronounce it. So we're not going to be going deep into the clinical aspects of specialty drug management. Rather, I am a supply chain geek who is pretty much obsessed with bringing greater efficiency and transparency to the world of drug pricing, which is why I found such a great home here at Capital RX. We are a mission-driven organization, a healthcare technology company looking to fundamentally change the way drugs are priced and patients are cared for here in the United States. So our focus today is going to be technical and economic. We're going to focus on specialty drug economics, how PBMs derive profit from specialty drugs, and what plan sponsors should be doing to manage costs in this particularly expensive category of drugs. Now, I said there were 2 disclosures. Second disclosure, the photo that you're looking at here was like 4 years old. I think it was taken literally on my first day when I joined Capital RX about 4 years ago. So if you want to see what 4 years in the trenches of the PBM industry can do to a human being, you can go ahead and compare that photo to what you see now on the live video feed, and hopefully appreciate a couple of the gray hairs that I've acquired along the way. Now, let's go ahead and get started and dig right in. Now, before we get into specialty specifically, I think it's important to understand how specialty drugs fit into the broader context of drug expenditures here in the United States. Now, those expenditures have steadily been going up for decades now. As you can see here, obviously, this trend expected to continue into the near term as well. PBMs are hired by plan sponsors to be stewards of their cost and utilization, particularly around specialty. And PBMs have introduced some pretty big strategies over the last couple of decades, ostensibly to try and tamp down the price and utilization of drugs. If you look here, the first of these mega strategies was the rise of PBM-owned mail order and soon thereafter specialty drug dispensing facilities, followed in the 20-teens by the introduction of what are called managed formularies. This is where PBMs start to exclude products from a formulary to aggressively steer patients towards preferred medications. And most recently, a wave of PBM mega mergers, what's referred to in the industry as vertical integration, in which the largest PBMs forged ownership alliances with the largest carriers and other entities up and down the supply chain. Now, it's still debatable whether these strategies have had a meaningful impact on the total cost of drugs here in the US. But one of the consequences that's hard to argue about of these 3 strategies is that they have all served to add complexity and diversity to the way that PBMs earn a profit, the way that they support their business. And that in some senses, they've added some opacity to that as well, making it a little more difficult for plan sponsors or patients to really understand where money is going within the supply chain. Now, the PBMs, as I mentioned early in the last couple decades, began to either acquire or build out specialty drug dispensing facilities as a result of the PBM ownership of specialty pharmacies and, importantly, their ability to steer utilization to those pharmacies. The PBM and the specialty pharmacy marketplace are basically more or less mirror images of each other right now. That is to say, we've got 3 traditional PBMs dominating both markets, each owned by a large national carrier, right? And this is no coincidence because carriers, the health plan carriers, rely very heavily on PBMs right now as a major profit center. And PBMs, in turn, rely on specialty pharmacy as a primary source of revenue and profit. So specialty pharmacies have really become an engine of growth for the largest healthcare companies that are operating here in the United States. Thanks to drug channels, I want to make sure y'all see citations clearly on this and give credit where it's due. This data comes from drug channels. It's from 2 different years, but directionally, I think it creates a good illustration of the similarities between these 2 marketplaces right now. Now, I mentioned that specialty is an engine of growth for carriers and for traditional PBMs. PBMs have really enjoyed what I would call like a triple tailwind of growth promoters within the world of specialty revenue. The 3 sources, three sort of sources of jet fuel, as it were, for the growth of specialty within the PBM operation have been, number 1, the increases that we've seen in specialty drug utilization. And this comes from new drugs entering the market, treating new conditions, new indications being approved for existing products, the introduction of biosimilars, et cetera. The other big sort of tailwind, the force that's at work here is an increase in specialty unit price. So just as there's new drugs coming to market, those new drugs tend to come in at higher and higher price points, and inflation is affecting existing products on the market as well, driving the unit price up. And finally, and perhaps most importantly for the traditional PBM, it's a steady increase in what I call specialty capture. That is the ability of the PBM to capture the volume of specialty claims that are running through their clients, their plan sponsors' plans. And they do this by convincing clients in one way or another to limiting the dispensing of specialty drugs to the PBM's owned specialty assets. And the typical sort of strategy that they use is to withhold preferential pricing for the specialty drug unless that client agrees to essentially give all of their specialty volume to the traditional PBM. So because of these 3 tailwinds, this triple tailwind that has driven growth of specialty revenues for PBMs, specialty pharmacy growth has largely become synonymous now with PBM revenue growth. But this wasn't always the case. And as I present on topics like this, I do often feel that it's important to step back in time for a moment and acknowledge the evolution of the PBM business model, essentially where PBMs came from, because it didn't look at all like it looks today. In fact, when PBMs started off in this industry, they really were operating as administrators at an arm's length, negotiating with various entities up and down the supply chain, like pharmaceutical manufacturers, mail order and specialty providers, and retail pharmacies, and negotiating on behalf of the plan sponsor and typically operating on a fee-for-service basis, everything sort of above board for the client to see in terms of cost structure. But PBMs soon learned, the traditional PBMs soon learned that there was money to be made in dispensing. And so begins that first sort of mega trend that I highlighted on an earlier slide. And that is the ownership through acquisition or build out of mail order pharmacies. And soon thereafter, with the growth of specialty, the build out of multiple specialty pharmacies across the big PBMs. Now, it didn't stop there. Some of the PBMs, the larger PBMs in the industry, saw that same sort of potential for dispensing margin within the retail setting and established ownership connectivity with retail pharmacies. A couple of retail pharmacy chains and PBMs were connected for a while. There's now only one. And soon after that, they expanded up chain, sort of up channel, if you will, into the world of rebate negotiation, carving out what are called rebate aggregators. These are also referred to as group purchasing organizations or GPOs, and they serve the same function that the PBM historically already was doing, that is to say, negotiating with pharmaceutical companies for rebates. But importantly, they now were established as separate LLCs. And this is a nuance, but an important one in terms of the profit model of the typical PBM, because that separate LLC allows the PBM to shift profit from retained rebates outside of their core PBM business. And structurally, that creates a little more contractual freedom for them to have maneuverability on their profit. It didn't stop there. As I mentioned earlier, the wave of vertical integration hit the industry, and now we had the largest PBMs connected with the largest health plan carriers. You can see the PBM enterprise kind of taking the shape of an amoeba or an octopus, with arms reaching out up and down the supply chain. Everywhere an arm reaches out, another source of profit is mined by the PBMs. And perhaps the newest wave or trend we see in terms of the evolution of the PBM model, or the PBM carrier integrated model, is the acquisition or growth of management of provider groups themselves. This is actual physicians and other groups of providers. I call this the last mile of influence for healthcare utilization. And by that, I mean that once a PBM health plan, vertically integrated carrier, has direct contractual influence on the provider, they now have the ability to have greater control over that provider's behavior and, for example, be able to dictate with greater precision what types of prescriptions that provider may be writing for. So again, this is really has evolved to be an incredibly complex and convoluted business model. And it has also contributed to what is a highly diversified profit model. That's really the end result of all of this integration and expansion, is a PBM profit model that's both highly diversified and largely opaque too. So very difficult to discern exactly how much a PBM makes on a given drug or on a given patient. You can see that some of the sources of revenue here are pretty straightforward. As I mentioned, PBMs for a long time have been charging admin fees above board on the table for the client to see. We don't necessarily suspect that there's any inherent conflict of interest there. But if you look at some of the other sources of indirect revenue, indirect profit that the PBM relies on, things like spread pricing tactics that are outlined here in the blue section in retail network economics, or dispensing profit for mail order drugs. Dispensing profit in particular, now highest growth area is specialty drug dispensing profit. And the quiet retention of pharmaceutical company back-end revenue, what we casually refer to as rebates, but I suspect most folks on this call know it's actually comprised of a wide array of different revenue streams, rebates and non-rebate revenue streams. The challenge for plan sponsors with these other indirect revenue sources is that they have the potential to influence the PBM's behavior. What I call the M in PBM, the management that PBM does day to day. And we're going to spend some time on the webinar today unpacking some of the ways that these profit sources can actually influence behavior on a day-to-day basis. Historically, not much attention was paid to these indirect profit sources, but today there's been obviously an increased level of scrutiny, FTC investigation of the largest PBMs, state governments, federal governments looking to regulate and scrutinize exactly how these models work. Now, I've mentioned specialty drugs a few times, but I haven't really defined what they are, and that's because it's really hard to do that, okay? Specialty drugs do not have a unified industry-wide definition, a universally accepted definition. We know that there are certain characteristics listed here that make a drug likely to be considered specialty and grown in a lab, sort of a biologic manufacturing process instead of a chemical process. Those that are delivered via injection, maybe they treat rare diseases, but the biggest determinant seems to be their cost. And the lack of a unified definition has actually created some challenges for plan sponsors in the industry. And that's because without a unified definition, every PBM essentially gets to create their own specialty list, right? And you can see how certain drugs here have some ambiguity to them. Certainly Humira and the other drugs in the anti-TNF class, these are very clear-cut specialty drugs. They're very expensive, injectable, biological, large molecule products. But if you look at some of the other products, something like Repatha, it checks most of those boxes, right? This is a drug that's biologic, it's injectable, it's pretty expensive, but it's used to treat a very common disease state, hyperlipidemia. Would that be considered a specialty drug? Depends on the PBM that you ask. Novolog, it's injectable and biologic, but not very expensive, so that usually doesn't get included on specialty lists. This last one, this one's a curiosity too. It's not even injectable. It's an oral chemical agent, but it treats a narrow disease state. It's an HIV antiviral. And we do see some PBMs including that on their specialty list as later. As we'll learn in our discussion today, the definition itself and which drugs are included or excluded in the specialty definition can have a huge impact on the financial and the contractual commitments that the PBM is held to. And so there are real ramifications to this sort of casual definition of specialty drugs in the industry. Now, I've already said that specialty drugs are a big deal for PBMs, but they're also a really, really big deal for plan sponsors as well. If you take a look here, this article from just over a year ago, warning that health plans and plan sponsors were bracing for specialty drugs to eclipse 50% of total prescription spending, despite the fact that only a very small percentage of patients, usually less than 2% of patients, are generating this massive cost for plan sponsors. Depending on who you are and the PBM that you're with, things like that, other variables, your specialty spend may be approaching 50%. It may be a little less. Ours, within our book of business, tends to run a little lower than what we see as industry averages. But it's likely that you're heading in this direction if you're not there already. And what's interesting to me is if you look at the other side of the supply chain coin, if you look at net manufacturer revenue between traditional and specialty drugs, you could see that pivot point, right? That tipping point of 50% mark of 50% share has already been reached. They hit that somewhere in 2019, 2020, when greater than 50% of net manufacturer revenues were attributable to specialty drugs over traditional drugs. You can see this comes from IQVIA. So kudos to them for providing, tracking and providing that data. So again, the pipeline for drugs right now is dominated by specialty products, both originator, unique products, and biosimilars. And we're going to get to biosimilars. I know y'all are excited to talk about those, as am I. But this is what the future of drugs is really all about from the industry's perspective. Now, what do specialty drugs treat? Again, I'm not a clinician, so I don't want to get too deep into the clinical aspects of this, but you can see that specialty utilization right now and specialty costs are really dominated by a couple of major classes, one of which, the anti-inflammatory class, is the clear sort of dominant condition that's treated by specialty drugs in terms of cost. Some of the biggest blockbuster drugs in the world are part of that class, Humira and Enbrel and others, and we'll be talking about in some detail. But you also have anti-neoplastics, which are used to treat oncology conditions, cancers. You got dermatological agents, neurological agents, drugs that treat things like multiple sclerosis and other conditions. And we're going to, we'll be touching on some of those, but likely that we'll dig a little deeper into the anti-inflammatory class from an economic standpoint today, because there is a lot going on there. It is in a state of volatile transition with the introduction of some new biosimilars and the expiration of the patent for Humira. So we'll be digging in on that. Now, no discussion of specialty drugs would be complete without a mention, at least, of the specialty drugs that adjudicate and process under the medical plan. So just when you thought you had your head around all the specialty cost and utilization that you're managing as a health plan, lo and behold, you peek over onto your medical plan, and there's a whole nother set of drugs and a whole nother cost structure over there attributable to specialty drugs. These are largely infusion therapies. They might be administered in a doctor's office or in a hospital setting. They're typically billed through the medical plan, as I said, and this creates some challenges for plan sponsors, because what you now have is essentially a bifurcated supply chain, right? A split supply chain for plan sponsors to manage across two wildly different benefits that behave very differently. Some challenges include, number one, huge variations in cost across different sites of care for medical injectable specialty drugs. By that, I mean, you might have a drug that would cost 3 to 4 times more if it's administered in a hospital setting, an outpatient hospital setting, compared to what it might cost if administered in a home infusion setting. So just wild swings in cost depending on where the drug is infused and who's doing the administration. There are administration charges that are layered on top of it. Utilization management and prior authorization can be really inconsistent here, especially for a plan that's trying to manage consistently across the pharmacy and medical benefits. And let's not forget gene therapies. These are the newest wave, fresh on the scene, a batch of therapies that in some cases can cost north of $1 million per patient per year. These are life-saving therapies in some case, right? We applaud the introduction of these therapies into the market to the extent that they save lives and cure conditions. In some cases, these are curative therapies. However, they are creating existential threats, especially for smaller self-insured plan sponsors who would have a very, very difficult time absorbing the cost hit of a $1 or $2 million patient into their, relatively small benefit plan. So really, really interesting challenges even on the medical specialty side of drug. But let's get back to the pharmacy benefit, because this is where I think things get really interesting in terms of PBM economics. Okay, we're going to talk about how a PBM actually derives profit from a single specialty drug. We're going to take this claim. This is, I picked Humira randomly. You can really probably pick just about any specialty drug. But we're going to walk through the adjudication process and the dispensing process and identify along the way this journey of PBM profit that the patient goes through as they're moving through the process. And it starts with the submission of a prescription to the PBM. In that case, an administrative fee is charged typically by the PBM. Next thing, if they're taking a specialty drug and there's any chance of off-label use, which is a lot of specialty drugs, then typically a prior authorization is triggered, and that PBM will charge a PA fee. And that fee is typically charged whether or not the PA is approved or generates any savings. Number three, most specialty products have what are called copay cards. We're going to go into that in a little more detail later. The copay card is administered by the PBM. It's essentially sort of a dual processing of the claim in essence. And that copay card is managed by the PBM at a cost. And by that, I mean the PBM charges a fee, and that fee can actually be pretty significant. In some cases, 25, 30% of the value of the copay card can be quietly retained by the PBM. Next comes the big hit for the PBM. This is their largest source of profitability in the journey of profit for a specialty claim, and that's the dispensing profit of the claim itself. And the reason that this profit is so significant, and the reason that it makes such a difference for the PBM is that this is where the PBM actually has the greatest ability to manipulate profit, because they can manipulate price of the drug as it goes out the door. But they buy low, they sell high. There's a pretty significant dispensing profit there. Usually, that's not the end of the prescription. Usually there's refills, and the PBM will initiate a clinical program to manage those refills. In some cases, those clinical programs are funded by pharmaceutical company revenue. There is, I would argue, some hazy accounting, if you will, or it's some opacity at the very least around how those funds change hands. What is the volume of dollars that's changing hands to support those pharma programs? Do those programs represent a profit center for the PBM? In some cases, those pharma clinical program funds can be mined by the PBM for additional margin and additional profit. Next comes the rebate. About 6 months later, pharmaceutical company pays a rebate to the PBM. The PBM may or may not pass through the value of that rebate to the plan sponsor. But about a year later, at the end of the year, that PBM is going to aggregate all the data from the transactions that they process, and they'll sell that back to pharma, who is very hungry to learn about who's prescribing their drugs, where they're being dispensed, et cetera. Now, what I want to highlight here is how many of these profit sources are directly tied to the price of the drug. This is really significant to me, because where you have PBM profit tied directly to price of drug, you have a potential for conflict of interest. The analogy I use is like paying a PBM as a percent of drug cost that they're supposed to be managing is kind of like paying your accountant a percent of the tax that they tell you that you owe the government. Obviously, the accountant's job is to keep your tax liability as low as possible. But if you're paying them a percent of the tax that you pay the government, chances are that accountant's going to find ways to increase that tax liability over time. Look, you can't blame them. It's in their financial interest. And that's exactly what we see playing out in a number of traditional PBMs right now, is subtle ways that the PBM can either manipulate drug mix, manipulate drug volume, or even manipulate the price of the drug itself to derive additional profit. And all of that is due to the fact that they're relying on profit that is tied to price of drug. I'm going to give you examples of all three of those. I'm going to walk through those right now. The first I want to tackle is drug mix, okay? The PBM is tasked with serving as an important gatekeeper of expensive specialty drug utilization, right? Plan sponsors retain the PBM and put responsibility on them to operate a number of different gatekeeper functions: prior authorizations, step therapies, quantity limits, duration limits, and other checkpoints that the patient should pass through to ensure that the utilization is appropriate. And that's because just because a doctor prescribes a specialty drug doesn't necessarily mean that it's appropriate for that given patient. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's in line with prescribing guidelines or that it's not potential off-label use or diversion. And so this PBM has a really critical, a really important responsibility to serve as that objective gatekeeper. And if you ask most managed care pharmacists, and you ask them about prior authorizations for specialty products that are prone to off-label use or inappropriate prescribing patterns, they would tell you that appropriate prior authorization approval rate is probably somewhere in the 60 to 75% approval range. That is to say, there is always going to be some portion of prescriptions which just shouldn't have been written in the first place or should have been written differently, maybe a different product, different dose, et cetera. But when clients are surprised by when they actually go to their PBM, when plan sponsors actually go to their PBM and request reporting on the prior authorization approval and denial rates for specific drugs over the last year, most plan sponsors are actually pretty surprised to see typical patterns among traditional PBMs with PA approval rates in the mid 90s, high 90s, in some cases, 100% of claims for a particular specialty drug just kind of being waved through. This has everything to do with the misaligned incentives, but it also creates a really tough challenge for plan sponsors, because this single statistic, the PA approval and denial rate, can have an oversized impact on total cost that a plan sponsor incurs over a given year. If you see here, we've got a tale of two different PBMs. These are numbers that we worked on a spreadsheet here just for illustrative purposes, but they do make sense. That is to say, you got a rebate chaser PBM that's padding their formulary to get the best rebate average per claim they can get, but they've got a very high PA approval rate because they're also relying on specialty dispensing for profit. And then you've got an aligned PBM. Maybe their rebate isn't quite as good as the rebate chaser PBM, but they do a more vigilant job of PA management, right? A more objective gatekeeper, a more objective steward of the plan sponsor's funds. And you could see, despite the fact that that rebate looks better on the left-hand side, the bottom line total cost is far better for the plan sponsor under an aligned PBM arrangement. And this phenomenon here, what we're looking at as an illustration, can actually be a huge distortion factor when plan sponsors are running a PBM procurement or a renewal, because most consultant-led RFPs, for better or worse, tend to focus on guarantees. They tend to focus on the hard and fast pricing guarantees, the things captured in the top orange section of this table: minimum rebate guarantees, ingredient cost guarantees. And unfortunately, those spreadsheets that drive decision-making in a procurement largely ignore the financial impact of the PBM's behavior, right? The M, the management in PBM. And this can, unfortunately, sometimes lead clients to making, frankly, bad decisions in PBM procurement processes. Now, I mentioned that PBMs have ability to influence drug volume. This next slide or two is a really important illustration of that. I know it's a little bit little disorienting as you first look at it, but I'm going to walk you through how to read this chart. And I really hope that y'all understand what this means and how important it is. We get claims data all the time from traditional PBMs as part of the RFPs that we participate in. Clients that are currently with a large traditional PBM that owns a specialty dispensing facility, we get the data, we analyze it, we look for patterns, we look for opportunities for us to improve drug mix, volume, et cetera. And this is a pattern we see time and again in these data sets coming in. And I'm going to show you how to read this. This chart is a chronological chart from left to right. Each blue bar represents a single prescription fill, a refill, if you will, for a single prescription for a single patient. So this is a chart showing the Humira fills under a PBM-owned specialty pharmacy for a single patient over the course of the year. The light blue portions are the overlapping days supply of these fills. And by that, I mean the PBM has filled the prescription a little bit early, taking advantage of that early refill threshold, which is typically set somewhere in the 70 to 75% range for a lot of big PBMs. You can see 7 days early each month, right? That patient is accumulating excess supply. No, we obviously want them to have a little bit of excess supply on hand, right? In case there's an ice storm or something like that. But look at the cumulative effect of refilling that drug 7 days early, every single fill for the entire year. By the end of the year, this PBM has successfully dispensed 17 fills, 17 prescriptions for a single patient for Humira. You can track the cumulative excess days supply here. The total is 113 excess days supply of Humira at a cost of about $25,000 in wasted supply, excess supply that this particular plan sponsor picked up. That's 476 total days supply for a single year for 365 days. And look, this is Humira. This is a refrigerated medication. It's probably sitting in the patient's refrigerator. Every time they open the fridge, they're probably saying, why is this PBM keep sending me this? I've got it. I've got enough to last me a while, but the refills keep coming. And that's a product of the auto refill mechanism that most PBMs have convinced their clients to sign them up for. We do see this all the time, but it really is only in instances where the PBM is both dispensing the drug and also managing the refill rules for the plan. If you've got separation of church and state, as it were, between those two things, if you have the PBM managing the rules for the plan and some other entity dispensing, we don't tend to see this pattern at all. There's an even more pronounced version of this chart that I wanted to show you. I think this one is particularly fascinating. Same idea here. It's a different drug, but it's all for one patient. And look at them moving through their prescription fills over the course of a year. The first 6 fills were received via retail. You can see that this is the patient going in, getting the new prescription when they need the new fill. They're acquiring a couple of days of excess supply, but by the end of 6 fills, they've only got 8 days of excess supply. And thankfully for that, because this is Nerlynx, it's a really, really expensive breast cancer medication. But look at what happens as soon as that patient is moved over to the PBM-owned specialty pharmacy. The auto refill trigger kicks in, 7 days excess supply on an extremely expensive drug. And at the end of the year, that PBM has ramped up 69 days of excess supply at a cost of $45,000 excess, sort of wasted cost for the plan sponsor. This is, in my mind, the purest form of wastage in the industry right now. It is money that could be better spent on patients that would actually be using this medication. Look, this patient want this patient to have this drug. It's a breast cancer medication, but having 69 extra days supply of this expensive med is not going to solve for the patient's condition any faster. And so this really is something that plan sponsors need to be vigilant about. They need to be asking their PBM for reporting on this, and we're going to get into some examples of how you might do that. Now, I mentioned biosimilars. So I'm going to take a sip of my tea before I get into this, because this is a whole other topic. Now, this is the era of biosimilars right now. It's a really exciting year, and the next couple of years promise to be extremely exciting in this landscape as well. Biosimilars, for those that are relatively new to this, these are FDA-approved biologic medications that are designed to be highly similar, as close as possible, to a particular reference biological product, right? So to an existing branded product. Now, people have historically sort of described these as kind of like generics for specialty drugs, but we want to avoid that metaphor. We want to avoid that wording because they really don't behave like generics for a number of important reasons. The first of which is interchangeability. That is the pharmacist's ability, the dispensing pharmacist's ability to swap out a brand for a generic without having to go back to the doctor and get a new prescription. You can do that all the time on AB-rated oral generic products. But when it comes to specialty biosimilars, there's really only a handful that are designated as interchangeable by the Food and Drug Administration. And so what that does, there's interesting economic impact when a drug is not interchangeable. What that does is that shifts the power, the influence, if you will, away from the retail pharmacist back to the PBM, who now controls steerage for this class of drugs by way of the formulary and their ability to block access to one drug and force a patient to go back and get another prescription for a different product. And where there is formulary, there are going to be rebates. Trust me, that's how formularies work. And so what we're seeing is a landscape of biosimilars in which rebating is playing a massive part. And that's what makes this really fundamentally different than the world of oral generic products. But kudos to Cardinal Health and IPD Analytics, who are the source of this graphic here. I encourage you to look up the Cardinal Health summary report on the biosimilar pipeline that this comes from. It'll include some additional info, like what all these numbers and colors mean. I can tell you, generally speaking, though, the numbers represent the number of biosimilar products that are going to be associated with that reference product. And you can see the pipeline and where it's coming. This is massive dollars for plan sponsor, potentially some relief that will come over time. Humira, we have to call that one out. We're going to be digging deep on that one in a moment. But that is a massive drug. Eylea and Stelara. Eylea had $13 billion, about $13 billion in 2022 sales. That's billion with a B, folks. Stelara for psoriasis and Crohn's disease. That's about $10 billion in annual sales. We got over $50 billion in specialty drugs facing patent expiration this year and next. So this is going to be a huge biosimilar wave. It's really important for plan sponsors to understand how to navigate it. Let's dig in on Humira because, man, this one's a big one. Humira is, by literally any measure, the biggest blockbuster drug in the history of all drugs, period, full stop. Okay, so this drug had over $200 billion in total sales, estimated to generate about $240 billion in total sales by the end of next year. And as I mentioned, running well over $20 billion a year. These are massive dollars. It has since eclipsed Lipitor as the biggest drug in terms of total revenue. There are a number of biosimilar products hitting the market. There are clinical nuances here that I'm not really qualified to go into since I'm not a pharmacist. Things like differences in approved indications, interchangeability, formulations, things like that. So I'm going to instead focus on the economics here. The first thing I want to point out for plan sponsors listening in is that these discounts that you're seeing on the right-hand side, relative price differentials, are against the wholesale acquisition cost of Humira, or the WAC, not against the actual out-the-door cost, the net cost, as it were. There are pretty big discounts and rebates associated with Humira now. So don't expect that you're going to save 86%, for example, against your current Humira cost structure with the wave of these drugs coming out. The actual savings is going to be somewhat mitigated there. But what fascinates me really about this is the emergence of two distinct pricing strategies. Okay, this has everything to do with PBM formulary access. You've got one set of products that are priced at a relatively deep discount against the originator product WAC, against the Humira WAC. In some cases, as high as 85, 86% discount. And then you've got other products that are priced at a very incremental, marginal discount against the originator, something like 5%. Presumably, there's a really big rebate behind changing hands behind the scene on those high, what we call the high WAC or high list price versions of these products. In some cases, you've actually got the same manufacturer, like Amgen, Biocon, and Sandoz, pulling the same product off the manufacturing line and just putting it in a different box, a different NDC, exact same molecule. It's just getting two prices. And the whole point of this is for the manufacturer to have agility and be able to navigate and react to how PBMs behave in terms of formulary negotiations. If that PBM wants a big rebate, they're going to get a big rebate. If that PBM wants a lower list price product and they're going to forego the rebate, they've got that option as well. Now, I want to call out two products, okay, when it comes to Humira biosimilars, because they're of particular sort of buzzworthy interest, if you will. The first is Coherus's product. It's called Usimri. And this one's particularly interesting for two reasons. One, it's got a very low list price, a low WAC, but it also is from a company that has partnered with Mark Cuban Cost Plus Pharmacy to dispense Usimri at an even lower price. They're reporting out something in the neighborhood of about $570 out the door. So this is a real disruptor in the class. It's caused a lot of buzz, and it's setting the new benchmark, as it were, for low list pricing for Humira biosims. The second product I want to call out is not even on this list, because this list was created before it launched, or before it was announced, I should say. And by the way, before I move on to that next product, I do want to thank Drug Channels again for providing this this chart, very helpful array of information about the Humira biosim landscape. I encourage you all to check out Adam Fine's channel. He's a fellow drug supply chain geek like myself. But what's interesting about the second product I'm about to mention is that it's actually being issued by a PBM. So one of the largest PBMs in the industry, CVS, recently announced the formation of a new subsidiary LLC called Cordavis, with the intent on co-labeling a specialty product that's being manufactured by another manufacturer. According to press releases, this appears to be a longer-term strategy that they intend to deploy across multiple biosims. But the test case here is Sandoz biosim for Humira, which Cordavis, the CVS subsidiary, is going to be co-labeling. I want to be clear here, clear up the air. It does not appear that CVS is going to be doing any manufacturing here. This is in essence a relabeling operation in which Cordavis will be partnering with the manufacturer, essentially applying a new label, applying a new NDC to the product. And so if you think about the evolution of the PBM business model, we can add yet another bubble to this fun and now excruciatingly complex diagram. Let's go ahead and throw it on there. We've got specialty drug relabeler in the mix now as yet another extension of one of the amoeba arms here. While we're updating graphics, let's go back to this one and take a look at the journey of profit for us PBM specialty claim. In the case of this particular business model, and by the way, this could be emulated by other PBMs. So this could be one example of sort of what's to come in the traditional PBM profit model. But in this case, we now have a new source of profitability with the co-branded drug is sold to the PBM. There's what I would call a distribution markup or a manufacturer markup or a co-labeler markup in which the PBM parent company can derive some profitability. The big challenge for this, by the way, this is highlighted in red because this is another source of profit for a PBM that is tied to drug price. And plan sponsors need to be aware of that as another potential conflict. But the bigger challenge really for plan sponsors with a strategy like this is that it allows the PBM to control both the list price and the net price of this particular product. When a labeler owns the label, they own the NDC, they own the AWP and the WAC and have full control thereof. This means that the PBM could take value that used to flow through the supply chain as a rebate, which was passed back to plan sponsors, and they could rebucket this value, these dollars, as manufacturer profit, which would then be retained by the PBM enterprise. So again, a complicated business model becomes even more complicated. Lots to unpack here. We're all obviously keeping a watchful eye on how this particular strategy plays out, but more generally, keeping a real close eye on the Humira biosimilar landscape, because while it does provide promise of some savings for plan sponsors, I think are going to have to work to get their share of the savings. They're going to have to squeeze the PBM for it. Now, I know a lot of this discussion so far has kind of focused on sort of the bad news, as it were, the looming and increasing cost of specialty drugs and some of the tactics of PBMs to profiteer off of that. I do want to sort of move to a more positive section of the discussion here. Strategies that plan sponsors can and should be deploying right now to help mitigate costs in these expensive specialty drug categories. There's a whole quiver full of arrows, if you will, that plan sponsors should be pulling from. And all of these are important. I would argue that probably it starts with procurement and contracting. We'll get to that in a little bit. But each one of these is important in their own right as a lever or a strategy of being able to control or at least tamp down, mitigate some of the specialty drug costs. We'll start with formulary. The formulary world for specialty drugs has really changed a lot, particularly since the introduction of the managed formulary. And at this point, many specialty drug classes have enough brand to brand or brand to biosimilar competition that formulary exclusion strategies are pretty common, okay? And that means that rebating is expanding for those specialty classes and can really be very, very significant. Anyone who's issued an RFP for a PBM services lately and has asked for rebate guarantees broken out by brand retail, brand mail, and brand specialty, right? They're likely to be pretty jaw-dropped at the level of rebating that a PBM is willing to commit to in the specialty drug class. And that has a lot to do with the wave of biosimilars and the anticipated spike in rebate revenue that these might generate. You can see here, I'm rehashing some of the numbers for you. These are 2022 spend numbers, and the year indicates the year in which that product is likely to go to become available in biosimilar form. You can see over $50 billion really of market activity at play here. It's going to be a crazy couple of years. All eyes are on biosims, and whether PBMs are going to take a low WAC, low list price approach on a particular product, or whether they're going to pursue that higher WAC product or some mix thereof in order to get the outcome that PBM wants, whether that's a profit outcome or a cost outcome for their clients. I want to talk about copay card management. Again, I'm trying to cover a lot of ground here. Consider this sort of a crash course, if you will, in everything specialty. So while we're not going to go too deep into this, I do want to make sure folks understand the functionality of coupons, which are a form of direct-to-consumer funding that are provided by pharma manufacturers to help patients overcome the cost burden of high member cost share in plan designs, things like coinsurances and high deductibles, which became very prevalent over the last decade. Pharma offers this funding to offset member cost share. Plans have, there's been a bit of a game of cat and mouse, if you will, in this world of couponing, almost a Cold War going on between plan sponsors, pharmaceutical companies, and PBMs, all trying to optimize the use of these dollars and take advantage of these dollars if they are available on the table to be used. Most plans that we deal with have some form of coupon management in which they are backing the value of these coupons out of the deductible, in some cases increasing cost share for specific products to leverage the coupon value. This is an area of heated debate and heated legal activity as well. We see potential action taking shape here by specific manufacturers who are essentially warning folks, look, these programs weren't designed to support this type of use long term. We're going to have to start pulling back, creating more constraints, challenging the way that PBMs are using this. But generally speaking, if the money's on the table, most employers are taking advantage of this. The one thing to be aware of is that the fees for these programs can be extravagant. Many PBMs will charge 20, 30% of the coupon value. We believe a more appropriate way to administer this is with a flat, fair administrative fee that just covers the administrative costs. You can see how this can add up if you're paying a percent of coupon value. A particular drug, I'm hiding the drug name here, I don't want to get into that, but the annual cost for this product, about $140K. We are tracking current copay assistance value up to 20 grand in a year. If the PBM works all that value into their copay program, they're netting $5,000 in profit on this one drug just for getting the patient to sign up for the program. I can tell you on the operational side, I have visibility into it. It does not cost that much, folks. So again, make sure your PBM's fee structure for this is fair and reasonable. More aggressive strategies have evolved recently around needs-based funding, what's called patient assistance programs or PAPs, in which some plan sponsors who have essentially reached the end of their rope are now carving out medications and allowing patients to sort of try to navigate or facilitating navigation of these patient assistance programs for uninsured patients. This is usually really kind of a last resort for employers that have found that their specialty costs are simply unsustainable. More common down market with smaller plan sponsors. Most large plan sponsors don't wade into this. It's a sort of a contended area from a legal standpoint. But program fees for this can be extravagant. We do see the shared savings of 25 to 30% of funding. Something to watch out for, because those dollars can add up very quickly and generally are not reflective of the administrative cost burden of just helping the patient get what they need in this program. But the other thing to be aware of is that broker referral incentives are very, very commonplace in this particular ecosystem, and they can be significant too. So if this is being recommended to you by a broker or consultant, it's important that you ask them to divulge, is there compensation built in for you in this arrangement? And obviously under CAA, all of that compensation will have to be disclosed anyway. Refill protocols, we've already touched on this with those fun charts that I walked through earlier, but a couple of recommendations. Make sure that you understand what your auto refill policy is for your plan, because your PBM may have implemented something without you being fully aware. Don't dispense 90 days for specialty, regardless of what your PBM tells you. It's rarely, if ever, clinically appropriate. 30 days is a reasonable day supply for these very expensive medications, especially with employee turnover tending to be fairly high these days. Direct patient outreach should be conducted before each specialty fill. And by that, I mean, we didn't not just leave them a voice message and say, hey, watch out, it's coming, but actually get approval from the patient, confirm that that patient actually has a need for additional day supply. And then once you get that confirmation, send the specialty drug. And for certain oral specialty products, a split fill strategy makes sense. We're big supporters of this within our organization. This essentially takes a 30-day fill, splits it down into two 15-day fills, cuts the member cost share in half, and allows that patient time to determine, is this therapy working? Is it appropriate for me? Can I handle the side effects? And if so, great, let's get that second 15-day fill out quickly to them. Delivery is very efficient these days. This is not an unreasonable hoop to ask a patient to jump through, especially on medications that cost literally thousands and thousands of dollars per month. Now, I talked about contracting earlier and how definitions of specialty matter. Let's make sure we understand what those are. Those are as you're forging or executing a contract with a PBM. Make sure you understand how those different buckets and types of drugs will fall in or out of specialty definition. And look for exclusions too. There's a couple that I want to call out in particular. Number one, 340B claims. This one's kind of an oddity. What's going on here, and this is kind of a little secret right now in the industry, but most PBM-owned specialty pharmacies have quietly contracted with multiple health systems to serve as 340B contract dispensing pharmacies. This means that they now have acquisition cost access to 340B pricing. It can pass that through. Some of that profit is shared back with the hospital. Some of that profit is retained by the PBM, but this is important for plan sponsors. I know it looks like you're getting the drug at the same price, regardless of whether they get it from the deeply discounted 340B inventory or the other inventory. But I can tell you that if that claim is flagged as 340B, you're not going to be able to generate a rebate on that claim. And so any rebate yield that you were expecting on that very expensive specialty med is likely going to evaporate. Biosimilars are another interesting exclusion. They behave a little different than their originator products, but we see now that the rebate pattern is going to be pretty similar as long as we're talking about those high WAC versions. But what a lot of PBMs have done is they've quietly worked in language into their contracts over the last few years that basically says, we're not paying any rebates to you on biosimilars. We're not going to pass those through. Kind of a don't worry your pretty little head about it. We're not getting any rebates on biosimilars, so we're not going to pass them through. And that was back when biosimilars really weren't generating a substantial rebate yield. But in the New World Order, it's critically important that plan sponsors review their contract and ensure that the rebates are being passed through at 100%, even for biosimilar medications. Some other typical contract terms that we see around specialty products are exclusive dispensing arrangements. I mentioned that earlier. This is how PBMs steer patients to their own owned dispensing assets. Line item pricing for specialty drugs, which can be good if as long as it's competitive. Overall effective rate guarantees for specialty. Not all that effective in my mind, but we could talk about that on Q&A if we want. Again, exclusions here used to inflate performance. And let's remember, there's always going to be language in there that allows the PBM to modify pricing based on certain trigger events. So the contract that you're signing now may not be the contract or the pricing that you end up with down the road. We believe that alignment supersedes everything, okay? Beyond contracting, beyond dispensing, beyond unit price, alignment within our organization, we believe, is the fundamental ingredient to drive down specialty costs, because it puts the PBM on the same side of the negotiating table as the client. It puts them on the same team. It fully aligns incentives. And by that, I mean no profit sources derived from the price of the drug or tied to the price of the drug. So no own dispensing assets, 100% pass through of all those rebate and pharma revenue streams, cost plus economics at retail. We use NADAC. Other PBMs may use something else. We find that NADAC is optimal for us. But importantly, profit and retained revenue isolated to admin fees on the table, pay for value, right? Not pay for volume. And that's where we believe healthcare is going generally, and certainly where specialty drug economics are going. If there's some recommendations I can leave you with, some considerations as you maybe think about moving into your next season of RFPs, right? Number one, if you're a plan sponsor, please find a consultant that'll help you assess total cost. Look at those prior authorization, approval, and denial rates. Request them from your current client, from your current PBM. Ask for them from the prospective PBMs that you're evaluating, and compare the real world outcomes that could create for you from a cost structure standpoint. We obviously selfishly encourage you to consider aligned PBMs. We believe that it makes a material difference, and our book of business results, we believe, shows that demonstrably. And make sure you check on those auto refill protocols, folks. Some PBMs pricing may actually be contingent on you turning on auto refill and using exclusive dispensing for specialty, which can end up driving volume far in excess of what the patient needs for a successful clinical outcome. Now, with that, looks like I finished with enough time for us to have a couple minutes for questions. So I'm going to scroll up here and see, we've got a few in the box. Let's see. Are there any you want to answer, Hannah, that are more sort of logistical questions?
I've already answered those, Josh, so you can take them away from here. Okay,
great. All right, let's answer this one live. What is Capital RX's solution to avoid systemic waste by applying auto refill while keeping patient compliant with treatment plan? In this case, a dynamic auto refill algorithm is what makes the most sense. And by that, I mean, look back at the day supply acquired by the patient and determine your refill threshold, your refill too soon threshold based on that. It really, what I would argue is that a lot of traditional PBMs would struggle to implement an algorithm like this, first because it goes against their financial incentives, but moreover because it requires really a sophisticated adjudication platform. Fortunately for us, as many of you know, Capital RX has an industry-leading cloud-based brand new adjudication end-to-end pharmacy enterprise platform that we use. We call her Judy, and so it's relatively easy for us to adopt dynamic algorithms like this to basically scale the refill protocol according to the volume or the day supply that the patient has on hand. So find a PBM that's got a modern platform and implement a solution like that. Let's see. Okay, there was a question, the specialty PA approval rate of 90% versus 67% is pretty eye-opening. Is this one from an Adam Fine article or another industry leader? No, this is actually from anecdotal evidence that we've been gathering as we look at historicals for our incoming clients from their existing PBM versus the pattern that we see after those clients come on board. So this is based on an internal study of clients, a subset of which we were able to obtain reliable information of prior performance for those drugs and drug classes. Let's see. Can you explain how employers would not get access to 340B claim rebates if they're already earmarked for health systems? How would employers know this? This is a really tricky one and might be worthy of its own 30-minute webinar in and of itself. The bottom line is, if the claim comes from 340B inventory, you're not going to know it as a plan sponsor until long afterwards. In fact, you're not going to know it until you audit that rebate arrangement and the PBM discloses, well, these claims here are excluded from your rebate guarantee, and you're not going to get a rebate payment on them because some health system got the benefit of the 340B savings. There's really nothing you can do if you're contracted in such a way that doesn't protect you against that. So seek to understand how the contract's structured, and seek a PBM relationship where that PBM is willing to be transparent in monitoring that type of utilization and reporting it back to you. And generally speaking, that's going to be a PBM that has that sort of that objectivity. Looks like we're right at 3 o'clock. Hannah, thank you very much for hosting this. And thanks to everyone for joining us for the last hour. Hopefully you got something out of it. I really enjoyed it. As you can all tell, this is a topic that I'm particularly passionate about, and it's a landscape that is rapidly evolving and changing. So we appreciate you plugging in and hope to see you on the next Capital RX webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Josh.